Man actually had a joke about my age. I guess he thought twice about using it this morning. I was going to give everybody our website address so they could look up his resume. It worked. Anyway, Happy New Year, everyone, and good morning. As you've already heard, there's kind of a mixed bag of news in a lot of these slides, but the general trend, as we see it, is generally positive. So going forward, frankly, coming into this fourth quarter last year, we were surprised when we started to tally up the results, and looking forward, I think we're much more optimistic today than we probably would have been around Thanksgiving last year. First slide is 25 years of growth and contraction data that we kind of rely on to give us some clue as to what might be going on in the future. You've seen this slide many times before, and we've always talked about the two previous down cycles being roughly 4 years in length, almost precisely 4 years in length, and being almost the same amount of space that contracted, and then the bounce back afterwards from that. This year, I'd like to point out, just focus on three specific years, and that's kind of the big bang years, which are the first years of each of the down cycles. You'll note in 1992, that number's about 1.5 million of negative absorption. And then in 2001, we were about 1.3 million, 1.350 negative absorption. And now suddenly in 2009, the number's about 1 million, 1.05 million in negative absorption. Now, we've all been reading papers for the last 2.5 years, and we all know that this was the greatest recession since the Great Depression. So something doesn't add up between what's happening in our marketplace with negative absorption in the first year actually decreasing now in the third cycle, and what was going on in the national economy, which was job losses and contractions all over the map. So this is kind of the first clue that we had that maybe this down cycle might actually turn out to be a little less severe. Even though from everything you would read, you would say, how could that be going on? And then, of course, in the final last year, 2010, if you were here last year, we predicted about a negative 500,000 feet. And again, looking back and looking at these cycles, and that would have been about the right amount, we thought. And we were surprised coming in at a negative 362,000 feet last year. So, clearly some kind of trend, and I'll talk about that in a couple slides, to what we think might be going on here. This is a slide we always use as kind of the barometer of health for the Philadelphia CBD office market. I think you could use this for any market in the country, frankly. Again, a 25 historical slide that shows you the occupancy level, literally, bodies and seats for the downtown office market. And it's kind of a good news, bad news picture, if you would. The good news is kind of on the right-hand side of the slide, if you would. There's two aspects of good news here. One is that you see just before we started kind of down into the recession, we had not a great slope of growth, but we had a decent slope there. And a lot of that was due to Comcast and their dramatic growth downtown, as well as a number of the tenants that populated Sears Center came in from the suburbs, which was a positive for the city. And then the other piece of that good news, I think, is the downside of that slope, which is, again, despite all the devastating news around the country, the downside here has been rather muted, and we haven't fallen off the cliff, so to speak. The bad news part of this slide is that when you look back at the late 80s, when the Skyline got underway and we changed, and a lot of Class A trophy space was added to the market, there was a dramatic growth in the occupancy of the downtown, driving up from 25 million to a peak back then of 35 million feet. So an enormous spurt of 10 million feet of occupied space. Since that time, we've basically been treading water, and that's a long time to tread water in an office market. The average for the years from the top of that last peak through to today is about 33,600,000 feet. So you can see that we've just kind of slid up and down around that. So clearly, despite all the changes in the downtown, changing demographics, all the positive things that have been going on, from an office owner's standpoint, in terms of looking at occupancy, something's still amiss, or we'd be growing and starting up a new slope, at least somewhere in and along this long period of time. It just hasn't happened, and topics for conversation on another presentation, but clearly that's one of the big issues here. Emerging issues for 2011. We actually have 3 of them this year. SNDA, Subordination Non-Disturbance Agreement, as most of you are aware, it's a document that in my history of 25, 30 years of practice, you never really saw so much unless it was a major tenant in the building taking 10% or more, and then the attorneys and the lenders got involved in the SNDA documents. Well, with the change in values of office buildings and the debt issues with a lot of office buildings, SNDA agreements have kind of become the new document, if you would, that doesn't go along with every transaction, certainly. But now tenants that even occupy a floor or less think they need one and make demands for them as part of their negotiations. And the problem, of course, with these documents is, unlike all the lease terms, which you can document ahead of time and kind of get out of the way, landlord and tenant can agree that they're going to get an SNDA document executed with the lender, but that negotiation kind of occurs after the fact, after the transaction is completed. And what has happened is it really introduces a new element of risk to the deal completion. We won't get into specifics, but we've seen a number of transactions in the last 6 to 12 months that have gone fairly swimmingly all the way to close the lease execution. And then, for a number of reasons, rights in the lease that the lender doesn't want to mirror in the SNDA and other issues, suddenly the SNDA agreement is a big problem. Haven't seen any transactions blow up yet because of it. In fact, a couple come close actually, but it ends up extending the amount of time it takes to finalize the transaction. And again, it introduces an element of risk that we haven't been used to in prior years. This is one where none of us are going to like, but except maybe the Center City landlords in this room. We're not there yet at $4, and if you believe the guy at ExxonMobil, he's talking about $5, I think, now for 012. We did see this once before, several years ago, downtown, or in the economy. And the reaction downtown that we saw was that all of a sudden, inspections of buildings, we got new names. We had names of tenants that were in the Philadelphia suburbs. Now, we see them occasionally, in a typical year, but not to the extent we started to see them when you started seeing those headlines about how fast gas was going up, how full the septic trains were. You all remember those days. Well, if the trend is back to $4 and $5 a gallon gasoline, we think that will change the velocity and activity level downtown fairly quickly. And for any landlord, and obviously for the overall occupancy, probably a big positive. Not a great positive to our wallets, but from a Center City perspective, it could lead to more concentration of office space in the downtown. And then finally, FASB 13, a lot of you in the room probably do not use GAAP accounting, but for those that do, you're more than well aware of the changes that are underway in the accounting regs to bring the United States regs kind of in line with the international regs. And the big issue for operating leases is, under current accounting rules, an operating lease is just that. You put a year's worth of expense on an average basis on your books, and that's all you have to deal with. Well, FASB 13 changes that, all in the goal of making the true liabilities of the corporation a little more transparent to the investor. And essentially what happens, and I'm not going to get into an accounting lesson here because I'm not the one to do it, but here's a quick example, and of course you have this slide in your package of what happens. This is a 10-year lease that, if you follow through the math, under current accounting, we put about $2.5 million of operating expense on this company's books. All right, what happens under FASB 13 is that lease gets capitalized, or at least a segment of that rent stream gets capitalized as a discount to present value, and that's what's in the little box called initial valuation of $11 million. All right, if this was a 15-year lease, it would probably go on the books as $15 million. So suddenly, this is one single lease on the books now as an $11 to $15 million liability that will then amortize down over the lease. And then in addition to that, still carry as an operating expense on that firm's books are the taxes and operating costs and whatever that were associated with that lease. They kind of bifurcate the lease in the accounting practice. So clearly, this presents new issues for the CFO department of any corporation on GAAP accounting that may have 100 leases out there, 1,000 leases out there. Retailers have 4,000 and 5,000 leases out there. When all these leases have to be evaluated, capitalized, and then a large amalgamated number placed on the books as a liability of that company. We think one of the things that's going to happen here is that firms will start to take a look at whether or not they need a 15-year lease or an 18-year lease or a 12-year lease in lieu of doing a 10 or something shorter, all because it affects this initial valuation number.